Spider-Man and handheld games have a pretty rich history. Here on the channel we've looked at his releases on the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo DS and the 3DS, and whilst there have been some mixed games, there are also some hidden gems in there. Which means today, finally, we are looking at the Spider-Man PSP releases. Now the PSP is home to 4 different Spider-Man games releasing between 2005 and 2008. Now, without giving too many spoilers, there are some pretty good games here, but there are also some pretty bad games here as well. So without further ado, let's go to our first game, and that is Spider-Man 2. So, most versions of Spider-Man 2 launched in 2004 around the same time the film of the same name released. However, the PSP version and some regions of the DS port did not come out until March 2005, and even as late as September 2005, which is over a year after the film released. This version was developed by our good friends over at Vicarious Visions, and we know by now that they've handled this IP for quite a while, so they know what they're doing. So I'm not going to beat around the bush. Spider-Man 2 on PSP is very average. It has some good moments, it also has some really awkward bad moments. This game reuses the engine that the original Tobey Maguire Spider-Man game used on consoles, and it also reuses a lot of the soundtrack and areas from that first game as well, and it's very obvious if you have played that previous game. So let's talk gameplay, and let's start off with the positives about the gameplay. The combat, whilst fairly generic, feels very good in this game. There are upgrades and different combos you can buy, which is a fairly common thing in these Spider-Man games, but overall, in terms of the actual fighting, it's pretty good. There's a scoring system which has also been taken from that first Spider-Man game, and again that works pretty well here as well. You are scored on combat as well as how much time it's taken you to complete the level. Now, whilst the game is not 3D open world, it does feature full 3D open environments within the levels, which you can swing around, crawl up walls, sometimes go through vents, and so on and so forth. Swinging is fine, it's okay. There's not really much necessity for it, so when you do it, it feels fine. Wall crawling, although a little bit janky at times, also works pretty well. You can hold the left bumper button to speed up Spider-Man's crawling as well, because otherwise it just feels incredibly slow. There are also some other little interactive bits you'll have to do, like rescuing civilians and carrying them to certain points, which is fine, it's not too annoying. There is an arrow in levels that guides you where to go, but it's not particularly helpful when there's loads of windy corridors and the arrow's just pointing at a wall that you can't pass, because obviously you have to go a certain way to get to it. But for the most part, gameplay wise, it's fine. The only thing that really brings this experience down is the camera. Oh my god, I had so much problem with the camera in this game. It's so awkward, it doesn't turn with you at certain points when it really should. And because the PSP only has one analog nub and a D-pad on the same side, you couldn't really move both at once. So you can move the camera with the D-pad, but you can't be walking or moving whilst you do it because you only have one thumb on that side. But even if you emulate this game and remap the D-pad controls to another analog stick on a regular controller, you still can't move the camera and move Spider-Man at the same time. Which of course would not be an issue if the camera, without controlling it, worked well enough. So Spider-Man 2 has these pretty nice pre-rendered CG cutscenes that feature the voice actors from the films. In fact, the PSP version is the only version of the game to feature J.K. Simmons reprising his role as J. Jonah Jameson, which is pretty cool. These cutscenes look pretty good, even by today's standards, to be honest with you, and honestly the game itself doesn't look that bad either. Bearing in mind this was made in an older engine by the time this launched on the PSP, it still looks pretty good. I mean, when you're playing it on the actual PSP console, it looks nice because the screen's small. If you're emulating this and stretching it to a full 1080p screen, it's obviously going to look worse. The Spidey suit looks good, the NPC civilians just look fine, the textures and grounds and everything, they look fine as well. There's some interesting design choices for some of the characters. I have to say I was a bit confused by the Mysterio design. I'm not sure if that's one from a comic that I've missed, but I don't remember him looking exactly like that, but hey ho. Whilst the game does loosely follow the plot of the film, there are a lot of additions to this plot of different characters, including, as I mentioned, Mysterio, the Vulture, Shocker, and the Rhino. Even with these additions to the plot, it does still follow pretty much the same beats that the film does, just with some extras. One thing I do fondly look back on in this era of Spider-Man games is Bruce Campbell narrating the tutorial and just the rest of the game, and he does that once again in this PSP version. So if you played any games from this era, you'll know to expect some pretty funny one-liners and sarcasm throughout the game. So in terms of critical response, honestly the game didn't do too bad. I mean, bearing in mind it was the very first 3D Spider-Man game on a handheld system, I think they did a pretty good job. So the meta score for this game is a 67 out of 100. Not great, but not bad either. It puts it in the mixed or average realm, and that goes for the user score as well with a 6.2 out of 10. I think if you played this game back in the day when it came out, you would definitely look fondly back on it, but I think going into it with a new look, it's not quite as good. So before we go any further, if you are a fan of Spider-Man games, superhero games, or just movie games in general, then this channel would be perfect for you, so why not hit that subscribe button, tap the bell for notifications of all my future uploads. So in this video I've got the games in order of release, and the date that I'm referring to is the European release. Now interestingly enough, for our next couple of entries they both actually launched on the same day. So to break up the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man games, we are next looking at Spider-Man Friend or Foe. This game launched on November 2nd in 2007 and was developed by Artificial Mind and Movement, who were known for porting licensed games to handheld and would eventually go on to make the Iron Man DS game as well. So the game opens with a pretty nice CG cutscene that I'm pretty sure is in most versions of this game. It's Spidey fighting the Green Goblin, Doc Ock and some other villains, and he gets assisted by the New Goblin. Then they are all attacked by a group of mysterious symbiotes, and then they all teleport away. So unlike most Spider-Man games, this game is a beat 'em up with a tiny bit of platforming. There is next to no web swinging in this game, with just a few platforms needing you to use it, and to be honest with you, you can also play as loads of other characters as well that aren't Spider-Man who don't web swing, so it's not so vital to this game. In fact, this game does have a pretty impressive roster. There are a couple of characters that unfortunately are not in this version of the game, and those are Silver Sable, Prowler, the Lizard, and the Scorpion. However, the PSP version does have two exclusive characters, and those are Electro and Carnage, which is pretty cool. Now, this game is not a Tobey Maguire Spider-Man story, but it does for some reason feature a lot of the designs from those films, including Spider-Man himself, the New Goblin, Sandman, Doc Ock. They all look like their film counterparts, but it also of course features characters who were not in those films. It's very weird. Now, to be honest, outside of the cool premise and the roster, I didn't like this game very much. I had this on PS2 and I enjoyed that version when I was a kid, but having now played the DS and PSP ports, I'm really not a fan. Movement, to be honest, is slow, jumping feels really weird, the combat is barely passable, sometimes the hitboxes are good, sometimes they're completely terrible. It's really hit and miss, but outside of all this averageness, the biggest crime of this game is the flashing screens. Anytime there's a small micro cutscene or an enemy appears or basically anything happens in the game flashes twice in white to tell you that there's going to be something going on, but like the whole screen flashes white. And honestly, I'm not photosensitive, but after about 20 minutes I started to feel quite sick playing this game. For the purposes of not feeling sick and safety, I have edited these flashes out of the video, so you don't have to look at them as I did. Graphically, the game looks fine, the character models are all okay, the enemies look pretty good, and the environments, although they are boring and quite generic, they don't look ugly, so that's one good thing. Now, I'm not sure if I experienced a glitch whilst playing this game, but the soundtrack I didn't really get to hear much of because throughout half the levels it just doesn't play. When you get to a big room and there's a boss fight or you're on a menu, then there's music, but just moving around levels I didn't really hear that much. And to be honest, even what I did hear was just aggressively average, which honestly sums up pretty much every version of Spider-Man Friend or Foe. And really, that is a shame because the concept is pretty cool. Take Spider-Man outside of New York, have him battle a new enemy alongside his previous foes that you can also play as, and yet they somehow made that boring. So boring. This is a game where Blade and Venom can fight alongside each other, and somehow I'm bored. Why? At the end of the day, this is a game very clearly targeted towards younger audience, whereas the Spider-Man Tobey Maguire tie-in games are more for everyone, or even slightly older. I don't know, man, I'm kinda sick of using the excuse of, oh, this is a kid's game so it's okay to be bad. Just make the kid's game good as well. Why set the bar so low? Anyway, apologies for my rant there, let's talk about the critical score. So, Spider-Man Friend or Foe holds a 58 out of 100 metascore on the PSP, which again puts it in the mixed or average realm, but in the lower half of that. The PSP port was not quite the worst reviewed version of the game, as that prestigious title belongs to the DS port with just a little bit of a lower score at 55 out of 100. Anyway, if I talk about Spider-Man Friend or Foe anymore, I'm going to fall asleep, so let's move on to the next game. Okay, so next up we have Spider-Man 3. This version of the game was developed by Vicarious Visions and released the same day as Friend or Foe on November 2nd, 2007 here in Europe. Much like Spider-Man 2, pretty much all the cast of the film come back here to voice their characters. So you have Tobey Maguire, James Franco, Topher Grace, Thomas Hayden Church, J.K. Simmons, and Bruce Campbell, who once again narrates the game. So in terms of the combat, it's pretty similar to Spider-Man 2. It's combos that you unlock with hero points, there's a score system, so on and so forth. However, this is a fully fledged 3D open world game on the PSP. This is a 3D open world Spider-Man game on the PSP. I had to repeat it because I'm very impressed. So yeah, pretty much this is a port of the PS2 version, but with a few additional features. So the plot again pretty much follows the Spider-Man 3 plot, but somehow makes it even more chaotic. Spider-Man 3 as a film had a lot going on. You had Sandman, you had Venom, and you also had the new Goblin. This time around though, as well as those characters, we have even more. We've got Lizard, we've got Kraven the Hunter, we've got Shriek, and even Morbius. So yes, that means that this game has Venom, Kraven the Hunter, and Morbius. Wow, all we needed was Madame Web and we could have had a Sony Universe film reunion. Also, just as a side note, I will openly admit that I'm one of the few people that saw every single Sony Spider-Man spin-off universe film in cinemas, and I'm so embarrassed. So finally, we have a handheld Spider-Man game that actually relies on web swinging as part of the core mechanics. You activate the web swinging by pressing the right bumper button, and then you use the analog nub to control whether you're going to go up or down, left and right. You can either hold or tap the X button to get a boost or jump while swinging. It's fairly similar to the previous two console counterparts of these games. It's just a little bit more awkward because it's on handheld. Overall though, the web swinging actually feels pretty good, and honestly I'd say it's almost as good as the Spider-Man 2 and 3 console versions. Wall crawling is also slightly less janky now. You can still move a bit faster whilst crawling, because it can be quite slow. If you hit the buildings at a certain speed, you can run up them as well, which is pretty cool. In terms of web swinging and movement, this is definitely the best handheld Spider-Man game, hands down. However, really, that's where my compliments will end. There is a lot of jank and a lot of weird choices made in this game. Now, the Wii and PS2 versions of this game already weren't very good, and whilst they have refined some of those issues here, it's still not fantastic. Graphically, this game looks absolutely horrible, I'm going to be honest with you. The Spider-Man suit looks fine, but everything else, obviously they've had to scale down the game to fit on a PSP, I understand that, but my god, I can't even make out the faces of half of the NPCs, they just look horrible. New York itself, to be honest, doesn't look great. The buildings all look the same. The textures on the ground and the buildings look horrible. I get that they had to port this onto the console, so it was going to look a bit compressed, but I'm sure they could have done something a bit better than just green ground, not even actual grass. My other big gripe with this game is the nonsensical missions. There's just some ridiculous things that happen that you have to overlook. At one point, an informant lets Spider-Man know that there's stolen machine parts, and you find them in an abandoned trailer, just in the middle of New York, and then you have a quick time event to rip the back doors off so you can get the part out, oh my god, I've never had to button mash a button so hard in my entire life, like it took so long that my fingers started to cramp. But then I thought, hey, that's fine, I've done it now, let's take this machine part to the police. So you hand it to the police, and then he tells you, well, there's still more machine parts to find, so you turn around and the same trailer that you've just ripped the door off is now sealed again with another part. So you take the part from that trailer, again, after a quick time event, again, and instead of taking this stolen part to the police, you just take it to some random civilian. Because that's what the game tells you to do. Why not just send you back to the cop? Maybe he's undercover, I don't know, but it just doesn't make any sense. Introduced specifically for the PSP port, we also now have Conquest mode, which is just this mode where you have 5 minutes to get around the city and rack up as many points as you possibly can, basically just completing different city events like crimes, or those machine part rescuing quick time events I mentioned previously. Overall, Spider-Man 3 for the PSP is a very mixed bag. Whilst yes, it is undeniably cool that there is a 3D open world Spider-Man game on a handheld, especially as early as the PSP, but on the other hand, this game is plagued with a lot of technical issues, and that is because it's on a PSP. Ugly textures, poor quality audio, wonky controls, it just adds up to a very uneven experience. I would say unless you really want to play a 3D open world Spider-Man game on a handheld console, just don't bother playing this. Unfortunately, the Metacritic score does reflect this as well, with a 52 out of 100, which puts it right at the bottom of mixed or average. Again, I think if you played this game back in the day when it came out, you'll probably have some heavy nostalgia for this, but if you go into this with a fresh set of eyes, it's probably not that great. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, please comment the iconic "See ya chump" in the comments down below.
See ya, chump.
So last but certainly not least, we have Spider-Man Web of Shadows Amazing Allies Edition. This was developed by Amaze Entertainment and launched in October 2008 worldwide. Now, the Amazing Allies Edition is a version exclusive to the PS2 and PSP. It's a 2.5D side-scrolling platformer beat-em-up. Now, we have already covered the DS version of this game on the channel, which I guess in a way is somewhat similar to this version, except on the DS it was more of a Metroidvania kind of type game. So in terms of gameplay, Spider-Man controls pretty well. In fact, I would say he controls very well here. This 2D environment harkens back to a lot of the previous Spider-Man games we've covered on the channel, but it feels pretty good and fluid here. He moves quite fast, he swings quite fast on the odd occasion that you need him to. Overall, Spider-Man feels quite good to control. When combat actually works, I'd say it's pretty much at its best here on the PSP. Hitting enemies into the air, chaining combos, slamming them back down feels very, very satisfying. The only downside is that the hit detection on enemies can be really, really poor sometimes. Especially when you hit them to the ground, there's this very long window of invincibility for the enemy that can just completely ruin the flow of what you're doing. But for the most part, it handles pretty well. So let's talk about the ally system. In the main home console versions of this game, you had a variety of different allies that could assist you, pretty much depending on whether you were a good guy or a bad guy. There is still that morality system in play here, but it doesn't really affect the game as much as it does in the home console versions, so instead you've now got power-ups. At any given time in a level, you can have 5 different, or some of the same power-ups if you want, assigned to your screen. They can vary from something as simple as a health boost, an attack boost, or you can have someone like Moon Knight pop up and help you on the screen. The allies range from ridiculous things like the Citizens of New York throwing stuff, Stiltman, but then you've got characters like Storm and Moon Knight, which is pretty cool. I played this game for a couple of hours and not once did it really explain how this power-up system worked. About 40 minutes in, I just kind of figured it out and started using them. But overall, it's a pretty nice addition to the game, and they can actually help you turn the tide in a boss battle. Now, in the other versions of Web of Shadows, Spider-Man doesn't really feel like himself. He just whines a lot and moans all the time and just doesn't really act like Peter Parker. But here in this game, the dialogue is very Peter Parker-esque. In fact, at some cases, it's actually very funny. Whilst he will occasionally say little one-liners, most of the dialogue in this game is delivered on screen as text. And whilst that does sound quite boring, it works quite well. There's a few different options you can choose from that affect your morality, but what it really does is it either gives you power-up points to your normal suit, or to the symbiote suit. There are lots of occasions where you can simply just tell citizens you're not going to help them, and you're just going to leave them in like a collapsing building or something, which is quite funny, but because I'm such a nice guy, I just saved everyone anyway. I think something in this game that stands out to me is that at some point in the story, quite early on, you find J. Jonah Jameson captive in some secret fortress, and he's been cloned, and they've made the clone super nice. There's this brief moment of panic where Spidey thinks, oh god, which one's which? And then the minute one of them starts shouting, you know exactly who you've got to save. I think what makes this game quite good is that it really just feels like a throwback to the early days of Spider-Man games, like we're talking the 90s, and it kind of sticks to that for better or worse in terms of the jank. But to be honest, overall it's a pretty fun game. It did feel a bit strange going from a 3D open world straight back into a 2D platformer, but honestly I had more fun with this than I did with Spider-Man 3. Now in terms of critical response, Spider-Man Web of Shadows on PSP doesn't actually have enough critic reviews to have a metascore. But if we take the 3 review scores that it does have and average that, it gives you a 74 out of 100, which is a pretty good score. In fact, that would mean that Web of Shadows Amazing Allies Edition is the best reviewed Spider-Man game for the PSP. Which, honestly, I can kinda get behind. Anyway, I just want to say a quick thank you to the members of my Discord server who recommended that I play these games, as well as the people who had previously commented this on some videos. And if you want to send me some recommendations, put them in the comments below or join my Discord server in the link in the description. And so that takes us to the end of our look at the Spider-Man games released for PSP. Now again, this has been a bit of a mixed bag, but overall, aside from Friend or Foe, there's been some positives here. What are your thoughts on these games? Do you have a favourite Spider-Man game on PSP? Again, please let me know in the comments if you do, as I would love to know. So thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and tap that bell for notifications. I will see you in next week's video. Bye bye.
See you, chump.